Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we continue the story of the Soviet partisan war against the Germans from 1941 to 1945. How did the partisans fight, and how did the Germans try to stop them? Hi Jesse, here we are once again, another week, another podcast, Partisans Part 2. So in the previous episode, we kind of tried to set the scene as we always do. I always say, well, let's zoom out and look a little bit at the strategic and the historical context. We also looked a little bit at the legal requirements, facts that people were facing at that particular time, because all of this can be quite confusing. We've said a number of times also in discussion amongst ourselves, it's a bit of a minefield, really, once you start opening this Pandora's box. It's very easy also to misunderstand statements. So, dear listeners, please bear with us as we go through these things. We're trying to show you what people in those days had a different view on a lot of things we're talking about, for example, and including partisan warfare, and how they could and even should be treated by the other side. So this is not necessarily how we would do things today, but it's all 1941 to 1945. We're trying to understand how and why people did it. I wouldn't say that means we give them a tick in the right sort of box, well done, but we're trying to understand where these ideas were coming from and what all of this meant on both sides of the wire, because that's we're looking at how they fought and what the consequence. And let's face the consequence of war, quite often that means the dying in war really were. With that relatively long introduction, maybe Jesse, again, where we take it, I think we said, well, today, because we've done the bigger picture stuff, we're going to zoom in and look a bit more at what actually happens on the let's call it the Eastern Front, even though it's not the front itself. It's part of the fighting area, isn't it? So we talked about it in the last episode, talking about the Eastern Front. If we just concentrate on the small bit of fighting where it happens between the main forces, is just wrong. And this is why we're doing this particular episode.
Indeed. And I think to get the ball rolling into what we want to talk about today, one of the things that we mentioned in the last episode is just how chaotic the early months of the German-Soviet war were as far as partisan and counter-partisan activity is concerned. Neither side had a detailed plan for partisan warfare. It's like a reaction to things that are happening as they happen. So both the partisans and the Germans are fairly disorganized, lacking resources, lacking coordination, lacking structure in their approach to this irregular conflict that's happening over this vast forested and swampy region of the Soviet Union. That starts to change in the second year of the war, in 1942. The Soviets realized right away, I quoted Stalin's speech in the last episode where he says, "We need partisan warfare," in his address to the nation. But that's not just words. The Soviet authorities and the Red Army begin to take steps to make use of this resource of these several 100,000 fighters that are behind enemy lines and that might be able to do something useful for the war effort. So one of the big steps in the Soviet partisan war is trying to gain control of the movement. As you mentioned, Matthias, in the last episode, Stalin's not the kind of guy who's chill with people having independent responsibility and decision-making. In fact, the military in general has, a specific place for initiative and then quite a large place for hierarchies. And so partisans are, in the Soviet view, a legitimate military force, and therefore they need to be subjected to a legitimate military hierarchy and a political one, because of course, communism being a totalitarian system, you've got to have your political influence at all levels of your military force as well. So in May 1942, this is one of the sort of milestones, the Soviets set up the central headquarters of the partisan movement. Now, they don't set this up in some forest in Belarus, of course. They set it up in Moscow, and it's under control of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So you can see right there, they want to have the partisans on a leash and make sure they know what they're doing and they're doing what Moscow wants them to do. Is it going to be as simple as that? Obviously not, because they're spread out, they're in the forest, they don't have enough radios for communication at first. But this is a big step. And they put two people in charge of this. They have Voroshilov, who's a military guy, and then they have his chief of staff, who's more of a political guy. And he has one of my favorite Slavic names that I've ever come across. I'm pretty sure he's an ethnic Ukrainian born in the Kuban region, which is outside of today's Ukraine, but there were a lot of Ukrainians who lived there and still live there. His name is Pantelimon Ponomarenko. So say that 5 times fast, and you get a prize. All right,
we're doing this.
We're doing that now with difficult words. So these guys are supposed to give out the orders, coordinate all the regional partisan headquarters that they also start creating. So you have a whole network, and this network decides what are your priorities, what are the new tactics. They share lessons learned and pass them along. They say, what do you need resource-wise? Do you need more ammunition? They do start, now this not at the beginning of 1942, but they do start dropping supplies and weapons to the partisans. It's probably never reaches the scale that the partisans would like, but you can see it's being developed as another branch of the Soviet Union's ability to fight the war in a coordinated fashion. They also send sometimes personnel behind the German lines in order to better train partisans or lead them. And of course, that helps with consolidating Moscow's control. If your own people are being sort of parachuted in to take control of certain units or to train and shape certain units. Now that May 1942 foundation of the headquarters comes with a document, an instruction on what to do. And it's fairly simple, and mostly it concentrates on destroying stuff. You've got to destroy, logistics. You've got to destroy enemy patrols. You've got to destroy food supplies, all that kind of thing. So, and one of the emphases, of course, is also taking out traitors, taking out local police who are collaborating with the Germans. That's a big emphasis, as I mentioned last time, and I have a few more examples of how that works. Railways are a big target. Intel is another thing that's mentioned in this May 1942 set of guidelines. The Red Army wants partisans to tell them how many Germans are in your area, what kind of units are there, what units are moving through towards the front on the rails to help the conventional war on the front. So this is kind of the package that the Soviets are starting to put together in the spring of 1942.
So there's a lot going on the Soviet side, as you can see. And everything is becoming more organized because everyone's also realizing now that this war is going to go on for quite some time. This is not a war that's going to be over very, very quick. You either lose or you win. So you probably have to shift and change your policies, your approaches to adopt these things and accept the fact that there's going to be more fighting. And of course, you find the same on the German side as well. I mean, the German side is also quite interesting because they look at the map in 1942, early 1942, and think, what's going to happen now? So the big offensive in 1941 failed. Russia is still in the war. You're now fighting a war against the US as well, in addition to Britain and the Empire. So this is actually in some ways not looking all that good, you might say. So they're, of course, still thinking that perhaps with the summer offensive in 1942, the Soviet Union will collapse. That's at least one of these ideas. And again, we talked about this in a different podcast when we talked about Stalingrad and the build-up for Stalingrad. So you basically just continue the war and hope that something good will happen. Now, this, of course, leaves you with a number of options here. You could either say, well, if this is going to be a prolonged war in the East, and yes, eventually it's all about living space, it's about getting rid of Jews and Slavs and subhumans and all these things, well, in the end, you're going to push through these policies and have all this territory for German settlers and whatever the idea is. You might say, okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to continue with this policy and just be extremely harsh and brutal, which of course means you really cheese off the population, even these parts that perhaps might even at that stage be a bit sitting on the fence, perhaps leaning towards the Germans. Again, we talked about this in the previous podcast. Not everyone is a hard supporter of communism in that part of the world. And then basically you fight the war, and at the same time you do the whole racial policy and these things. Or you say something different. Say, no, we need to change our approach here. We need to win over the population. We need to win, to use this great phrase, the hearts and minds of the people, because they can then support us, and we can then later still think about changing this and getting rid of them, killing them, deporting them, whatever it is that you want to do. You have an interesting shift there in the German approach, and we'll talk about the second part, the hearts and minds, later on. In 1942, it's pretty obvious that Hitler and the Nazi leadership, well, they still think, this hearts and minds thing with Slavs, we don't even talk to them. They're all subhumans. They're all weird, racially inferior. As Himmler once said, they shouldn't even be able to read and write. All they need to do is to understand orders given to them by their German masters. So we want to get rid of them. And that, of course, also means that in the rear area, you still have a very, very harsh regime. And that means now, interesting enough, in the summer of 1942, so shortly after the Soviets more kind of codified their approach, the Germans are going again a bit more extreme. In some ways, you might say, again, they're also codifying what's already been in existence, but they now make sure that from their point of view, the right sort of people are doing the right sort of job. And of course, that means the moment you go to the Eastern Front, you do nasty things. This is now where people in black uniforms get involved, and you have the SS coming in as well. There's, of course, again, it's a huge subject. We can't really go into this when you talk about Einsatzgruppen and execution of Jews also in the summer of 1941. I mean, that's all there. You have the cooperation with the Wehrmacht, so this myth of the clean Wehrmacht, which everyone now knows is a myth. So the Wehrmacht, of course, was involved. But what they do now is, in particular with regards to anti-partisan warfare, is again that they codify this. And so Hitler says, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to keep the original structure in place. So we have the frontline troops, and that's the area of the frontline troops. I talked about this briefly in the previous episode. And that area comes under the control of the army, or the military, in that case, the army normally, basically fighting on the front line. You then have the Kommandant Rückwärtige Gebiete, also a military person, could be up to 250 kilometers west to east, roughly speaking, something like this. Behind that, you've got the civilian authorities. And this is where the big change comes in now, because in the summer of 1942, in July, it is decreed that everything happening within the civilian territory, civilian organized and controlled territories, is now run by the SS when it comes to anti-partisan warfare. And that, of course, means that you have an approach which you might say perhaps is not much worse than what you had before, but again, it's more codified. And that is the interesting thing. So again, this brutality is now being codified, is okayed, is ticked off. We talked about the orders that have been put out in 1941. You still had a bit of fight back and pushback against these from some army commanders, not many, but some of them pushed back against this. By the time you give responsibility to the SS for all these things, it all changes. So from now on, the army in the rear areas, controlled by civilian administration, the army units, if there are any, are there now to support the SS in their fight against partisans. It's also interesting that they changed the terminology. So partisans are no longer called partisans or Freischärler. That's a term that the Germans use quite a lot, because partisans is a term they don't really use an awful lot. They use Freischärler, but the problem with this is free Schar means basically group. There is a link, a semantic link in German back to the Wars of Liberation, 1813, 1815, where of course these guys are great German heroes. So semantically, you might say that is something relatively positive. So you can't have a term which is something positive for what happens in the East. Again, as I said, I think in the last episode, one man's terrorist partisan is another man's freedom fighter. So they changed the terminology, and the official term that is now being used for everything to do with partisan and partisan warfare is bandits. So they are bandits. And that is really interesting as well. Again, we talked about some of the legal aspects in the previous episode, because the moment you say bandits, you take away the military status of these people and say, no, these are people who shouldn't be fighting. They're not protected by military law. And in addition to what we said in the order set out in 1941, the Kriegsgerichtsbarkeit Erlass, that again shows that these guys are on the wrong side of the law and they can and have to be dealt with in an appropriate way, which of course means you shoot them all. So basically they are just criminals, nothing more. That in itself is also quite interesting. And you then have a directive which Hitler signs in August 1942, and that's Directive 46. And here he also talks, amongst other things, about Partisans bandits, as they will call them now, and he calls for the complete extermination with the utmost brutality. So again, you can really see, if we hadn't already been on that path, which of course we are at that stage, because that had been the German approach from 1941, if you needed some sort of, what's the right word, encouragement to do nasty things, if that is the right word, I don't know what excuse. Here you have it, and here's the Führer Directive, utmost brutality that leads to complete annihilation and extermination of the bandit problem, as they would call it. So really interesting, the Germans going more extreme, changing the structure, the way they do it, while pretty much at the same time, the Soviets are also restructuring and putting things on a different footing.
Yeah, and the Soviets make changes fairly quickly in 1942 as well. So again, we have this kind of parallel developments on either side. And one of those parallel, it's not only a more organization, but it is also in a way more brutality, or organizing that brutality in a certain way. And let's face it, the partisans are not all saints either. There's no question that they are resisting an absolutely terrible enemy. I think most observers would agree with that basic underlying principle that fundamentally the partisan war is a defense against a genocidal invader, but they are not saints. And they apply violence quite liberally in different ways as well. Now, one of the shifts that you can see in 1942 is in the fall, in September, they update their guidebook. So the new headquarters that's created in the spring, they put out this initial order saying, hey, we want to hit the communications, we want intel on German units and all of that. Well, they make it much more explicit. There's a much more detailed document that comes out that's issued in September 1942. It includes all the basic principles from the spring document, but it gets more detailed, and it also expands the scope of their operations. So now there are things like, well, you should attack German airfields and try to destroy grounded aircraft. You should have an organized program to root out traitors and kill them. Partisan groups should try to infiltrate cities in order to commit sabotage acts there, because, of course, by their very nature, they need to hide. So the vast majority of partisans are in the countryside or the forests or the swamps or what have you. There are a few exceptions. The city of Odessa in today's Ukraine is a big exception because they had a huge underground network of catacombs and tunnels under the city, something like 100 kilometers. And so the partisans use those tunnels as a base. They have like bakeries in there. They have printing presses for their propaganda leaflets in there. And they give the Romanian occupying forces in that area a very difficult time. But that's more the exception. But you see that the Soviets want to extend the partisan war into the cities if they can. They also give more detailed instructions on how to recruit civilians to join this mostly former Red Army soldiers in the partisan units, and how to specifically look for people who would be good at reconnaissance, at intel gathering on the German forces. They're also more explicit about printing propaganda for the local population to gain more support, because the government in Moscow is kind of cut off from 80 million of its own people in this giant area. And it's worried. It's worried about losing control of them. It's worried about collaboration, because there's a lot of collaboration, of course, as there is in most countries when there's a military occupation. It sort of goes with the territory. And so propaganda becomes a bigger focus as well. This is partly going to make the partisan war have a bigger impact. And we'll talk about campaigns and the impact later on, or possibly in the next episode. Let's see. But it also increases the friction between the partisans and the civilians. So that's a difficult relationship. And one of the examples that they give in this September document is destroy warehouses of bread. Okay, it's good from the Soviet point of view if the German army doesn't have bread. Guess what? If the German army doesn't have bread, neither do the Soviet civilians in the occupied zone. Now, the Soviet authorities say you should distribute the bread to the local people and then burn down the warehouse. But if you can't, you just burn it all, right? So this does also have the impact of driving some locals to resent partisans and to become, in some cases, more sympathetic to the Germans, or maybe even join a local German-controlled militia to go after the partisans. That happens too. Not only in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, or Ukraine, where you also have a nationalistic opposition to the Soviets, but even in some other places as well, where there are Belarusians or ethnic Russians. So the war, from the Soviet point of view, is becoming more organized, a bit more professional, but also messier. No question about that.
Well, there is a rock and a hard place, I think, springs to mind, doesn't it, when you talk about the civilian population? I mean, it's not a great fate. You either got the Germans coming to your village, killing, do whatever, or partisans and or communist groups. It really is not a good situation to be in. That is, it's very true. And it's interesting, if the Germans had approached this differently at that particular stage and had understood this a bit more and had used that to their advantage, they could probably have, maybe not defeated, but at least have reduced the impact of partisan bandit warfare behind the front line. But because they were so blinded by the ideology that I said, they're all Slavs, all subhumans, we don't really care, it basically goes away. There are actually a number of people who already at this stage are beginning to think, no, we need to change our approach here. Particularly the Army Group Center, there is one particular corps who already in 1942 tries to change this, and the commander, he becomes known as the head of the anti-partisan warfare, because from 1942 onwards he then writes a number of pamphlets and also runs a number of anti-partisan basically courses for his troops behind the front line, how to deal with partisans, how to do this, whether it's the pure military side of things, or he's already beginning to start to think about hearts and minds. But across the board, that is still too early. That will come in a bit later. We can talk about this later on. So very much, you might say, a missed opportunity by the Germans here. They could really, really have used this. But for the civilian population, as we now said, it's really not a good place. I mean, if I just jump ahead very, very, very far for a brief moment towards the end of the war, I mean, it's not really the period we're talking about, but I think it's a good example of the rock and the hard place. And it's a different scenario. So we're now looking at Eastern Poland, and I'm just thinking about this, what is now Eastern Poland. I'm thinking about this because I was there only a few weeks ago on a military staff ride, and we were analyzing the 1941 operations. It was the Bug area, so demarcation line between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1941. So different periods. I'm jumping about a bit, but please follow this line of thought. So the Germans then take over. The area has been occupied by the Soviets, and there's of course a relatively strong Jewish settlement there as well. They then create what they call an open concentration camp. So that basically means they don't even have guards, so the Jews are still there, but they're not really controlled, not put behind barbed wire. When this changes and they say, okay, now it's your time to get deported, they all basically run away and disappear into the woods. And in there, they form a Jewish partisan group that fights against first the Germans, also the Poles, because they don't get along, to put it mildly. Later on, also against the Soviets. And it is, and now that's why I'm jumping ahead, in the summer of 1945, when the war is already over, it's the Polish, you might say the local home defense, home guard, which fights and engage with a small battle with these Jewish partisans / insurgents, whatever you want to call them, because they keep attacking the Polish settlements because they're looking for food. I mean, as I was jumping about a little bit, but to me personally, that was a very interesting example of this. The pressures all of these groups are under, and it really is not a nice situation to be, because whatever you do, you're making the wrong decisions. So it's really, really awful to be in that particular spot. That's not good.
Yeah, this is a loud and clear message on the human level: is you don't want to be somewhere in Eastern Europe during World War II. It's definitely one of the worst places to be, and not just because there's one threat, as you say. The pressures of war, the pressures of occupation, create multiple points of violence that's going in different directions between different groups at different times. And just an awful mess. And to maybe elaborate a little more on this point about partisans and civilians of different kinds, you mentioned the Poles. The idea of going after traitors and having partisans go after traitors, real and imagined, is a tricky one for the partisans because, for example, you have Polish nationalists or patriotic Poles, or you have the Polish resistance, that then there's a chance that they're not going to get along with some Soviet resistance, right? So Polish nationalists, Belarusian nationalists who want an independent Belarus, they're on the kind of list of people that the partisans might want to target, in addition to spies, citizens who've collaborated with the Germans and joined local German-controlled police forces, that kind of thing. One of the issues is this idea of what is treason behind the lines is not really defined by the Soviet authorities. So that leaves it up to whatever partisan unit commanders to decide who gets shot on the spot for treason or treasonous activities or collaborating and who doesn't. And that is a recipe for random violence that also creates frictions then, of course, with the civilian population. And since especially from 1942, you have also a kind of the partisan movement gets closer to the Red Army. It gets closer to Moscow in some ways. Also, ideologically, and how the war is conceived gets a bit closer. So this idea of an absolute total war of resistance, no holds barred, traitors deserve no quarter, etc., that becomes the worldview for a lot of the partisan units officially, which means that, for example, when they commit reprisals or take reprisals, carry out reprisals against people they think are traitors, it can get pretty nasty. They can burn entire villages as well. They don't burn anywhere near the number of villages that the Germans destroy in the Soviet Union, but it happens. They will implement collective punishments. So if they catch someone who they say is giving the Germans information, they might kill that person's family as well, including sometimes women and children, even though German reports, of course, then also tend for political reasons to exaggerate sometimes the crimes of the partisans. It is a real issue and it is a real problem. I have a quote here from a partisan doctor. And doctors are an interesting case because the partisans, they don't only accept volunteers, they sometimes conscript people in the areas that they control. So you can really see how it's becoming irregular but more structured. They're actually forcing people to join their ranks. They didn't do this across the board, but for people with specific expertise, like medical, that could happen. In any case, this particular doctor was a volunteer, and here's how he later described, and remember, he's probably writing this in the late 40s, early 50s, so you're going to see he's sticking to the ideological Soviet line, but I felt like it gives a good flavor of the mindset. He wrote this: "For all the people left on enemy territory, a severe test took place, which showed who was really a true patriot of his country and his people, and who wasn't. At a time when the heart of every true patriot was aching, the traitors met with joy and went to serve those hunters of men." That's the Germans. "They went to serve in the Gestapo, in the police, and in other vile posts. They helped the Germans crucify their own people. But during those same difficult times, the true patriots dug rusty weapons out, went looking for them in the water, they cleaned them, and they went to the forests and the swamps to take revenge against the enemy and against the traitors for the violation of the liberty and the honor of their people." So, pretty hyperbolic language there. Obviously, this is meant for post-war, we were the pure and the true. But I think it does reveal some of the mindset behind why the partisan movement was also violent and sometimes, well, I guess it's a judgment on my part, but you might say excessively violent.
Absolutely. I mean, I keep coming back to this. I've said it, I think, a number of times. Hard and Rock Place really springs to mind, doesn't it? What an awful situation to be in. Again, when you swing it back to the German side, to say, well, some people are beginning to think now and realize that, maybe we should be doing it differently. We can win this battle for the hearts and minds, or perhaps not win it, but at least bring a few more people over to our side, because the partisans and the communists are behaving so appallingly as well. But of course, that doesn't happen, because the moment you put Himmler and the SS in charge in the rear areas, that can't happen. So there we go. And to make things even worse, I think it's 23rd of October, if I'm not mistaken, Himmler appoints a chap called von dem Bach-Zelewski as the general base commander for anti-bandit warfare, as it's called. And Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski is infamous, not famous, infamous mainly because he took part in the German action against the Warsaw Uprising, where basically as a consequence then Warsaw, of course, gets flattened. He survives the war. He's locked up for a few years, but then I think dies in, I think it's 1973, if I'm not mistaken, as a free man. So he's a particularly nasty character in many ways. And the moment he also comes in, it is pretty obvious that there's going to be an unprecedented level of violence. And that's exactly what they do. It then it doesn't get worse, but you can again see there's more things happening, because when they're moving into October 1942, so they're beginning to see that even the summer offensive is not really working. They're now at Stalingrad, but things are not working well. The Soviet army is not collapsing. There is this activity in the rear area. So how are you going to counter this? So again in October 42, there's another order about anti-bandit warfare for Army Group Center, the rear area. It's followed by an OKH, so that's the Army Directive in December 1942. Again, you can see now we're shifting from the rear area, which is under the SS and civilian guards, to the more military area, talking for anti-bandit warfare in the East, which actually says that sentimental considerations are irresponsible. And so they're instructed, the people are instructed to shoot or even better, hang bandits, including women and perhaps also children. Because if you hang them, well, first of all, you save ammunition. The argument is also it's not as bad on the man's morale because you don't actively do it, you watch it. And we know that people went to watch it. It also sends out a very strong message, of course, to the civilian population. Again, there are obviously reasons where you might perhaps even say, if they'd gone through the legal system, that would have been justified because they killed people or whatever. In the vast majority of cases, of course, that is not the case. And also not particularly clever. And some of the military people, again, who go through this every day and they live with this partisan threat, and I actually say, first of all, it's extremely counterproductive. Some of them in their reports even call it poor taste, because that's not how you do it. So if you have to execute people, do it in a more tasteful manner so people don't see it, which I think is a bit weird.
Sure.
So that, of course, is completely ignored, is also resisted, mainly then again by Bach-Zelewski, more in the rear areas. So no, you're absolutely wrong. And while we have direct orders from the Reichsführer, so that's Himmler, to do all this, and there we are. And they just basically go around on this killing rampage, which actually you might say gets worse as the Germans realize that they're not winning this campaign, which probably also means because the Soviets are getting more organized now, there is more activity. So you can see it's a constant toing and froing, and you get this level of violence that keeps increasing here all the time. So again, if you are in that part of the world, it is absolutely awful. And these approaches that these guys take are really, really weird. You can bring it down to the tactical level as well for one moment if you want to. How do the Germans actually do this? I mean, how do you control such a vast area and make sure that you keep the arteries, so the supply lines open? Supply lines are very limited anyway in the Soviet Union. Again, in the Stalingrad episode, for example, we talked about this. When 6th Army marches towards Stalingrad, they're living off the supplies that can be brought forward on one railway line. And the German Quartermaster General of 6th Army, so he's responsible for logistics. He says, well, 6th Army is going to starve to death if we don't improve the logistical situation, and that is before 6 armies actually encircled. So you can see it's all very, very limited, which in a way you might say also makes it a bit easier, because do you need to control all of these big areas? Not really. As long as you can keep the supply lines open, you are fine. This is also what the Germans do. It's interesting. There's a shift already in 1941, actually, because in the early days, when something happened, you had a partisan attack, the Germans would actually, for example, you're on one of these roads, of course not paved, in the middle of nowhere, and you come under partisan attack, they would then go after the partisans into the woods. Going into woods, fighting in woods and forests causes a lot of casualties. And the Germans are not trained to do that either. So relatively quickly, they learned that there's no point in doing that. And if, for example, you come under fire or something explodes, all they do is they make sure that secure the fringes of the forests and make sure that the transport can still roll down these roads. But they don't. In situations like this, there are different situations. We can talk about them later on, the anti-partisan actions, the big ones. But in situations like this, smaller tactical situations, they're now more or less instructed not to go after the partisans, because then you're on the back foot. Don't do it. It will just cause casualties. And the numbers that are small and limited anyway will be reduced even further. And of course, the big problem for the Germans, generally speaking, again, is they simply do not have the manpower. And that means also the manpower that you do send to secure the rear areas is not normally who are stationed there on a continuous basis. Again, there are exceptions when you have these big operations. They bring in air force, they bring in sometimes even tanks. We'll talk about this later. But as the normal occupying forces and the ones who are supposed to control the area, these are the older units, so older men. These are reservists. They're not particularly well equipped. The numbers are extremely low. Quite often they actually use police units. So there's also there's a book, there's also has been turned into a documentary. It's called, is it No Ordinary Man or No Ordinary Man? Isn't it Ordinary Man? Ordinary Man. It's about Ordinary Man, yeah.
I think it's Ordinary Men, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's about a police battalion I think it's from Hamburg, and how these normal policemen were now put into this police battalion sent to the Eastern Front, how they suddenly kind of buy into this ideology and start going around killing, executing people, and doing everything that you would expect from the Germans on the Eastern Front at that particular time. How do these older people, family men, fathers, husbands, how do they suddenly turn and do this? And again, there are lots of arguments. We don't have to go through this book, but of course, when you read some of the accounts from the people there, is they just said, you know what, we're just scared. You're in this huge territory. You don't know what's going on. You've got no idea. You feel like a drop in the ocean, and suddenly there's always the threat, or perhaps the real attack, or the real events,
or the perceived threat, at least. Yeah.
So you're coming under these attacks, and of course that's because of fear. They said, well, then you act, and that of course means overreaction. It's not excusing what happened, but maybe from a human point of view makes it a bit easier to understand. So you can see all sorts of issues. And the troops that they used, they were so low. And the quality of them, Sicherungsdivisions, so security divisions, these were the people who are not fit for frontline service. These were the old, the medically unfit. So that is not the nicest place to be. Having said that, on the other hand, little family story. So when my grandfather died, and my grandmother, when she was old in her 70s, decided to hook up with this other fella, which everyone thought was quite sweet. And he always used to tell these great stories about the war, because he spent nearly 4.5 years on the Eastern Front. And he was a lorry driver in one of the tank divisions. And I always asked him, so when you drove your lorry through all this territory, any issues, any problems? He said, nope, never met a partisan in my life. They didn't exist, and we didn't do anything nasty to them because they didn't exist. I think, yeah, okay, maybe not, maybe not. There we are. So,
sure.
Okay, let's park that thought. But no, I just asked him, because he said very often, because they simply didn't have the manpower or the equipment, he said he was very often tasked to just drive all by himself without an escort or anything like this from one village to the next, or do whatever. And again, just shows you. So if you're thinking that you're surrounded by this sea of partisan evilness, or whatever you want to call it, but you can't even put proper convoys together to make sure that you're not being attacked. And he said, no, never any problem, because I was always nice to people, so people were nice back to me, never any problems. Which, if that is true, not quite sure, would link back in with the other things we've talked about, the population, the civilian population, probably just trying to survive in this really difficult situation, being put under all these tensions and pressures. And I mean, really not nice to be, not a nice place to be.
Of course. I mean, if you look at it from if we imagine a hypothetical where a German says, well, I was nice to those Soviet villagers and they gave me some bread and they were nice to me back and I drove on. From the Soviet point of view, they might say, the German asked me for bread and I think, he fully is within his rights to shoot me and kill my family and burn my house if I don't give it to him. So I gave it to him and I was nice to him because I didn't want to die.
Absolutely.
Right. So when there's that threat of death in the air, it changes the dynamic completely, which oftentimes for the ones who are able to inflict that violence, it appears as though people are friendly when in fact they're fearing for their lives. So we have this fear on both sides in different contexts, of course, and not equally, but still. But all this talk about civilians, again, this is central, right, to the partisan warfare, because it's not only about the partisans, it's about the people, those 80 million Soviet citizens who are around them. Those are the people who start in greater numbers in 1942, but especially after, to volunteer, to become partisans, which is, in general, I have to say, you've got, how can I put this delicately for public consumption here? You do have to have a certain amount of courage. Okay, I was going to go for another more popular expression, but let's leave it for now. You have to have a certain amount of courage. It's a big time risk to join the partisans, even though, of course, as the war starts to turn more in the favor of the Soviets, it becomes a little bit less risky, perhaps in the longer run, maybe not in the short term, but in the longer run, to join the partisans. So their numbers increase then in 1943, 1944, because you don't want to be perceived as having collaborated or not supported the partisans when you know your side's going to win. And even if you are a patriotic Soviet citizen who was just too afraid to join the partisans before, now is your chance. You can overcome that fear when you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, if your side is starting to win well into 1943. There are even some women who joined. We briefly mentioned Jewish Soviet citizens who also sometimes joined partisan groups, although the relationships were often not that good. It did exist. Soviet women also sometimes joined. Obviously, they're a minority, but irregular. Well, even in the regular Red Army, there were women. But this is an opportunity for Soviet women to participate directly in the war effort and in the fighting. There was even one. I came across a reference of one detachment near Smolensk in Western Russia. The detachment was called 13. And a partisan detachment, and it had an all-female reconnaissance unit. So you can imagine there are certain advantages to that. Germans probably don't perceive women as much of a threat, and they can slip into a village, make some observations, slip out of a village more easily than a group of men or a single man might be able to do. So there was a role for female partisans as well. I did want to mention, I'd left out an interesting quote here from Stalin. I'm just going to throw it back in. We're doing things in an unconventional way in these partisan episodes, just like the partisans themselves. How's that for a historic justification for jumping around? But on this topic of the relationship with the civilians, one of the issues here is, in Moscow, it's easy to say, we want maximum destruction. Just destroy everything, right? And Stalin puts out this order. This is all the way back in November 1941, but it speaks to this idea of relationships with the civilians. He says, the German army is unaccustomed to fight in winter conditions, and having no winter uniforms in early November 1941, it stays mainly in settlements, in towns, right? Because that's where the shelter is. His instruction to the partisans is destroy and burn to the ground all settlements in the rear of the German army at a distance from 40 to 60 kilometers from the front line and from 20 to 30 kilometers on both sides of the roads. I mean, this is a draconian plan that is not realistic. I mean, you can't have, no matter how many partisans you have, they're not going to burn every town within 60 kilometers of the front line and within 30 kilometers of every road or major road in the Soviet Union. So when they do burn things, it creates friction. And here you have the top dog telling you to burn half the country, regardless of losses. Yes, they get more organized, but there's still a kind of a strange mindset sometimes behind the political leadership in some cases as well. So a bit of a mixed bag, let's say. I guess, we're repeating ourselves, but the civilians get the worst end of the
as they always do.
As they always do. No question about it.
Yes, absolutely.
In modern warfare, yes.
I thought it was interesting when you were talking about women and female partisans, just triggered a thought. Whenever you watch a film about the Eastern Front, there's going to be some sort of partisan stuff in there. And in a lot of cases, you will always then find the female partisan who does whatever she does, and it becomes one of it's the heroine of the story, perhaps we might even say. And it's particularly strong and striking when you watch German war films from perhaps the 1950s and 1960s. That is a common theme. You always have a female partisan. Even in other parts of the world, for example, there's Die Grünen Teufel von Monte Cassino, the Green Devils of Monte Cassino. There's a female, Italian, of course, now partisan in there. But that's not our front today, so let's move to the east again. The one that immediately sprang to mind as you were talking was Hunde wollte ewig leben, Dogs do you want to live forever? It's the Stalingrad film. And of course, there is, tell that very quick story very, very quickly. So there's this German officer who's been sent to Stalingrad. He meets this Russian pianist. She speaks fluent German because her father had admired Germany in the interwar period. And then they meet later again in Stalingrad, where he's now kind of starving, and she's joined the partisans, and she feeds him and gives him a Russian hat so he can basically put it on and get away back to his front line. So you can see it's always that sub-theme. So there's always that woman. She joins the partisans. Then, of course, she falls in love with one of these German guys. She kind of more or less saves him, and everything is good and well. It's a very interesting theme that you see running through these. Not entirely sure why they're always there, but it is a very interesting theme that comes up time and time again. It's funny.
I mean, I think it's very useful for a film, for the drama, for the human interest story. You got to have a love story. You got to have a this and a that. I wouldn't, obviously, and I'm not saying you would do this, Matthias, but the history guy.
It was all a bit different. I mean, we've talked about films in the previous podcast, haven't we? And exactly.
Yeah. There were women partisans. There's no question. Maybe a couple of them fancied a German soldier or a Romanian soldier. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's particularly representative. And yet, it's in films all the time, but that's how it goes. The job of a film is to entertain and not always to be true to the spirit of the historical experience, let's say. So, are we ready to wrap up this second episode on partisan warfare?
I think we are.
All right. It won't be the last one because we've got a lot more ground to cover. Today, we talked a lot about how the partisan war evolves in the middle of the war, especially in 1942, where you have both sides recovering from the initial disorganization and shock, trying to organize better, trying to achieve their goals, and trying to organize the way that they use violence. And of course, that has a huge impact on the civilian population, those 80 million people at the beginning of the war anyway, who are living in this vast area. Who get stuck in the middle, who get repressed and killed by the Germans, who get recruited by the partisans, and who sometimes are also subject to reprisals by partisans. So it's a complete mess, even though it's becoming more organized, more professional, and becoming a more significant part of the whole war on the Eastern Front. And in our next episode, I think we'll take things to the end and talk about essentially the peak of partisan warfare when it really becomes a factor in operations and in how things develop in the East in 43 and 44. So Thank you all for watching and listening. We hope you're enjoying this mini-series on partisan warfare. If you want to vote on future topics that we might cover on the podcast, or if you want to just support us because you like what we do, you can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can even get a free month trial to our exclusive content that's on our website, not available in public. And you can get that free trial by using the code word, thanks to Matthias, Deep Dark Woods. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
In today's episode, we continue the story of the Soviet partisan war against the Germans. So I need to do it again because I had something popping up here. Show me quality check. I don't want a quality check. Go away. Go away. Go away. Okay.